It was a typical Tuesday afternoon. The low hum of our suburban neighborhood buzzed outside, and the sunlight filtered in through our living room windows, casting a warm, golden glow across the walls. I was nestled comfortably in my favorite chair, sipping on a cup of chamomile tea and flipping through the pages of a new novel. It was a quiet moment, a peaceful one, a kind of peace that I had come to cherish in our home. The front door opened with a creak, and I looked up. My husband, Mark, stepped inside, his gaze distant, his posture tense. At first, I thought he'd had a rough day at work, another one of those stress-filled meetings he'd been complaining about for the past few weeks. But then I noticed the look in his eyes, something deeper than stress or fatigue, something that made my stomach twist. He closed the door gently, as if he didn't want to break the silence too abruptly, and walked toward me, hesitating at the edge of the room. "Hey," I said, offering a small smile, trying to lighten the air. "You're home early." He barely returned my smile, and instead, he stood there, hands fidgeting in his pockets. Yeah, I got off a bit early." His voice sounded unsteady, a tone I wasn't used to hearing from him. Mark was usually so self-assured, so level-headed. Seeing him like this felt surreal. I closed my book and set it aside, a subtle pang of worry rising in my chest. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice soft but tinged with concern. He exhaled deeply, as if gathering his words. I need to talk to you about something. It's complicated." He swallowed, and my heart thudded harder in my chest. 1,000 possibilities flashed through my mind. Was it something about his job? Had he been hiding something from me? But before I could let my imagination run wild, I heard footsteps behind him. It was a woman. She walked in slowly, almost as if she were afraid to step further into our home, her figure framed by the sunlight filtering through the doorway. She was beautiful, with soft, auburn hair that fell just past her shoulders and eyes that glistened with a mixture of fear and vulnerability. I knew her instantly, Emma. She was the kind of person who left an impression, even if you'd only seen her once in a photograph. She was Mark's first love, the one who had been a ghost in our lives, hovering silently in the background of his memories. I felt my heart race as I stood up from my chair, clutching my hands together in an attempt to steady myself. "Emma?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to intrude. I didn't know where else to go." A strange, hollow silence settled between the three of us, and I felt a weight pressing down on my chest. My gaze flickered from Emma to Mark, seeking an explanation, some piece of information that could make sense of this surreal moment. Mark took a step closer, his eyes pleading, as if he were silently asking for forgiveness before he'd even spoken. She's pregnant," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with a meaning that I couldn't quite process. "She doesn't know what to do, and she came to me for help." I felt a jolt run through me, like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Pregnant. The word echoed in my mind, sharp and unyielding. My head was spinning, my thoughts clashing and colliding with one another. It felt as if I had stumbled into a scene from someone else's life, some drama filled with emotions I hadn't prepared myself to feel. I searched Mark's face, hoping he'd offer more, explain how this had happened, why Emma was here, and why he had brought her to me. But all he did was stare back at me, his face etched with a mix of sorrow and guilt. My thoughts scrambled, piecing together fragments of memories, stories Mark had shared about Emma in the early days of our relationship, anecdotes from a time before I'd known him. She was the girl he'd first loved, a love that had been left unfinished, unresolved, and now, it seemed, reignited. A bitter taste rose in my mouth as I grappled with the reality of the situation. They hadn't spoken in years, at least as far as I knew. And yet, here she was, a living embodiment of his past, carrying his child, their child. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. I didn't mean to sound harsh, but a flood of emotions was coursing through me, hurt, anger, confusion, and an odd pang of empathy that I couldn't quite place. Emma looked up, her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know where else to go, she repeated, her voice barely audible. I found out a few weeks ago, and it was a shock. I didn't think this would ever happen. Anne. I remembered Mark. I remembered the man he used to be, and I hoped, maybe he could help me. She trailed off, her voice cracking under the weight of her words. Mark stepped forward, his face etched with guilt. She's scared, he said, his voice laced with concern. She doesn't have anyone else. Her family, they aren't in her life anymore. She didn't know where to turn, so she reached out to me. And I couldn't. I couldn't turn her away. His words hit me hard, and a wave of resentment rose within me. Couldn't turn her away? I wanted to ask if he'd thought of me when he'd made that decision, if he'd considered the impact this would have on our life, our marriage. But I held my tongue, my mind swirling with emotions I didn't yet know how to express. I looked back at Emma, seeing the desperation in her eyes, and despite the turmoil in my heart, I felt a pang of compassion for her. She was lost, alone, and afraid. And while I felt threatened by her presence, by what her return meant for my relationship with Mark, I also couldn't ignore the raw vulnerability in her gaze. Taking a shaky breath, I steadied myself. So, what now? I asked, my voice tight. Mark glanced at Emma, then back at me. I don't know, he admitted, his voice a whisper. I didn't want to keep this from you. I wanted to be honest with you and, maybe figure out a way to help her together. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. Help her together. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. Here I was, standing in my own home, facing a woman from my husband's past, and being asked to help them navigate a situation that could tear us apart. Yet, as I looked at both of them, I felt an undeniable pull to understand, to dig deeper into my own strength and empathy, even if my own heart was breaking in the process. In that moment, I realized that this was only the beginning. The revelation had shattered the fragile piece of my life, but it was a reality I couldn't ignore. And somehow, I knew I would have to find a way to face it, no matter where it would lead. Time felt like it had stopped. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the woman who'd once held my husband's heart, who was now standing in my living room, pregnant, vulnerable, and clearly unsure of herself. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my future, my home, seemed to blur in that single moment. I couldn't ignore the painful irony of it all. Here was Emma, the woman whose name I had heard only in fragments and vague anecdotes, brought to life in my living room. It was surreal, like a dream or an old movie coming back to haunt me. But this was no story. She was flesh and blood, breathing the same air I was, her presence a reminder of a chapter in my husband's life that I hadn't lived through, one I'd believed was closed for good. I glanced at Mark, seeking some reassurance, some hint that this was all a misunderstanding. But his face, etched with guilt and worry, told me otherwise. I could see it in his eyes, he was torn, wanting to protect Emma while still trying to spare my feelings. But how could he? There was no gentle way to soften this blow. The silence between us grew unbearable. How could this happen? I finally managed to say, my voice trembling as I fought to keep my composure. A dozen questions crowded my mind, each more painful than the last. Was this truly just an accident? How could someone who was supposed to be part of his past suddenly become so present? Emma looked up, guilt and pain written across her face. She seemed smaller than I remembered from the old photos, somehow more fragile. Her hands clutched protectively over her stomach, a gesture that struck me deeply. The silent acknowledgement of the life growing inside her, a life that was suddenly so entangled in my own, was almost too much to bear. I didn't plan for any of this, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at Mark, and then back at me, her eyes pleading for understanding. I know how it must look, but I didn't reach out to him to disrupt your life or to come between you. I had nowhere else to go. The raw honesty in her voice forced me to pause. I'd been so consumed by my own shock and anger that I hadn't even considered her perspective. She was as much a victim of this situation as I was. The idea of her being alone, frightened, carrying a child with no support, softened my anger just enough to see her vulnerability. But that didn't make the situation any less painful. Why come to us? I asked, struggling to keep the edge out of my voice. My eyes flicked to Mark, hoping he would offer some clarity. He cleared his throat, glancing down at the floor as if gathering his thoughts. Emma doesn't have family nearby, he explained, his tone gentle, almost apologetic. Her parents live in another country now, and, well, she didn't have anyone else. She reached out to me, and I wanted to help. The words stung. He wanted to help her, just like that. Did he think about how this would affect us, how this would affect me? Or was his instinct to protect her still so strong that he'd forgotten the commitment he'd made to me? I struggled to keep my emotions under control, but the questions kept bubbling up. How long had they been talking? Had he confided in her about our life, our dreams? Or was it only when she told him she was pregnant that he decided to reach out? I wanted to ask him all of this. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the hurt and confusion paralyzed me. Instead, I swallowed my pride, trying to listen to him, trying to make sense of this chaotic mess. Emma shifted uncomfortably, her gaze fixed on the floor. I'm sorry, she murmured. I never meant to intrude on your life like this. I didn't know who else to turn to. And then, when I found out I was pregnant, she stopped, her voice cracking as tears welled up in her eyes. For a brief moment, my anger faltered. I saw a woman who was hurting, a woman who was scared and alone, thrust into a situation she didn't have control over. And as much as I wanted to shut her out, to tell her to leave and never come back, something inside me softened. I couldn't deny her humanity, her vulnerability. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly as I tried to gather my thoughts. This is a lot to take in, I said finally, my voice barely steady. I need some time to process all of this. Mark reached out to touch my hand, but I pulled away, feeling the sting of betrayal wash over me. It wasn't fair, perhaps, but I needed a moment to myself. I'll be in the kitchen, I said, retreating from the room. The need for space, to gather my thoughts, to breathe, was overwhelming. In the quiet sanctuary of the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, clutching its edge as if it could anchor me to reality. My mind was spinning, my heart racing as I replayed everything I'd just heard. How had things come to this? Our marriage, once solid and dependable, now felt fractured, with pieces of his past breaking through the surface and shattering the foundation we'd built together. I felt a rush of memories come flooding back, the day Mark had proposed to me, his face lit with joy, our wedding day, when we'd promised to face life's challenges together. And now, here we were, facing a test I had never seen coming, one I hadn't prepared for. I couldn't help but wonder, had he ever truly let her go? Had I been living in the shadow of their love this entire time, oblivious to the lingering ties between them? In the back of my mind, a small voice whispered, this doesn't have to mean the end. People had weathered more difficult storms than this, hadn't they? I'd read stories of marriages that had survived infidelities, financial crises, even deep-seated betrayals. But this was different. This wasn't just about Mark and me, it was about an innocent child, a life that had nothing to do with the choices we'd made or the love we'd shared. That complicated everything. The sound of footsteps broke me out of my thoughts. Mark entered the kitchen, his face drawn and weary. He approached me cautiously, like someone approaching a wild animal, unsure if I'd lash out or retreat. I know this is hard, he said, his voice soft. And I know I'm asking a lot. But I didn't want to keep this from you. I wanted to be honest. I met his gaze, struggling to understand the man I thought I knew. Honest? I repeated, my voice filled with disbelief. You think telling me about this now counts as honesty? He winced, but held my gaze. I know it doesn't make up for anything. But I didn't want to go through this alone. I wanted to face this with you. The sincerity in his voice was clear, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the faintest trace of the man I'd married. But it wasn't enough. Not now, not yet. I need time, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. I need time to figure out what this means for us, for me. He nodded, stepping back, giving me the space I desperately needed. As he left the kitchen, I was left alone with my thoughts, the weight of this revelation pressing down on me like a tidal wave. In that quiet moment, one thing became clear: whatever happened next, my life would never be the same. The following morning, I awoke with a heaviness in my chest. I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle in its usual morning quiet. Mark was already awake. I could hear the low murmur of his voice from downstairs. He was probably talking to Emma, who was spending the night in our guest room. I felt a pang of resentment at that thought. A part of me couldn't believe that she was here, staying in my home, bringing her ghosts and vulnerabilities with her. I forced myself out of bed, steeling myself for what lay ahead. Today, I needed answers. I needed to understand how my life had been upended in an instant and to confront the raw emotions simmering just beneath the surface. I couldn't let them fester any longer. As I entered the kitchen, I found Mark and Emma at the table, their voices low and intimate. They were talking quietly, their heads bent close together. The sight twisted something in me, a jealous, bitter ache I hadn't felt in a long time. It felt intrusive, like I'd stumbled upon a moment that belonged only to the two of them. Seeing them like this made me feel like an outsider in my own home. I cleared my throat, and they both looked up, their faces registering surprise, and in Emma's case, a hint of guilt. Mark, ever the peacemaker, immediately stood up and gestured for me to take his seat. I shook my head, not ready for any gestures of goodwill. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My words were directed at both of them, but my gaze lingered on Mark. "All three of us." Emma glanced nervously at Mark, who gave her a slight nod. She straightened in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes cast downward. "I think we're long overdue for some honesty," I said, my voice cold but controlled. I didn't want to fall apart, not here, not now. "So, tell me, Emma, why did you come here? Why did you reach out to Mark? I deserve to understand what's really going on." Emma swallowed, her face pale and drawn. She seemed younger in that moment, vulnerable in a way that took me off guard. I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said softly, her gaze still fixed on the table. I was scared. I didn't know who else to turn to. "But why Mark?" I pressed, the frustration building inside me. "There are other people you could have turned to, other places you could have gone. Why him?" She finally looked up, meeting my gaze. "Because he's the only person I ever felt safe with," she admitted, her voice trembling. "When I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. I felt completely alone. I haven't spoken to my parents in years, and the friends I have, they wouldn't understand." The weight of her words hung in the air, and I felt my heart twist, both in pain and in reluctant empathy. I could see the truth in her face. She was frightened, truly alone in a way that I couldn't fully understand. Still, it didn't justify her decision to come here, to our home, disrupting the life Mark and I had built. "Emma," I said, trying to choose my words carefully, "you have to understand how difficult this is for me. To see you here, to know that you're carrying a part of Mark's past, it's painful." She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know. I can't imagine what you must be feeling. And I wouldn't have come if I thought I had any other option." Her voice broke, and she took a shaky breath, gathering herself. "Mark has always been someone I trusted. And when I realized I was going to be a mother, I wanted to do the right thing. I thought he might help me figure it out." Mark, who had been silent this entire time, finally spoke. "This wasn't an easy decision for me either," he said, his gaze steady on mine. "I didn't just want to turn her away without a second thought. She's carrying a child, and I felt responsible, in a way." I struggled to hold his gaze, feeling both hurt and betrayal. "So, you thought bringing her here, to our home, was the best choice?" My voice quivered, despite my attempt to keep it steady. "You didn't think about how that would affect me?" Mark ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated and helpless. "Of course I thought about you," he said softly. "I've thought about nothing else since she showed up at my office that day. But I didn't know what else to do." I didn't want to keep this a secret from you, I wanted to be honest with you. I thought, maybe together, we could figure out a way to help her. The word together stung. He was asking me to support him, to understand him, to help him navigate this impossible situation. And yet, he hadn't given me the chance to prepare, to brace myself for this intrusion into our lives. My mind raced, struggling to process everything. What about us, Mark? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What happens to our life, our marriage, with all of this? I gestured toward Emma, who watched us with a mixture of guilt and sadness. Mark looked down, a shadow crossing his face. I don't know, he admitted. But I love you. I don't want to lose what we have. His words hit me with a strange mix of comfort and pain. I knew he loved me, I could see it in his eyes, in the way he held himself, careful not to push me too far. But his actions had brought someone else into our lives, someone who was now inextricably linked to us, whether I wanted her to be or not. Emma shifted in her seat, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. I'm not here to ruin your marriage, she said, her voice soft and tentative. I need some guidance. And after everything Mark and I shared, I thought he might help me find a way forward. There it was again, a painful reminder of the history they'd shared, a bond that I had never fully understood. I'd always known Emma was Mark's first love, that their relationship had been intense and meaningful. But I'd thought it was over. Seeing her here, hearing the unspoken connection in their words, made me question whether it had truly ended, or if she had simply taken a back seat to our life together, lingering as an invisible presence. I'm willing to help you, I said finally, my voice strained. But I need boundaries. I need to know where I stand in all of this. I looked at Mark, searching his face for reassurance, some proof that I still mattered, that I hadn't been relegated to the background of my own marriage. Mark nodded, relief softening his features. We'll take this one step at a time, he promised. Whatever you need, we'll figure it out together. Emma looked at me, gratitude mingling with guilt in her eyes. Thank you, she murmured, barely able to meet my gaze. I know this isn't easy for you. Her words barely registered. My heart was still aching, torn between my compassion for her and the resentment simmering within me. But one thing was clear, I couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. I had a choice to make: either I would face this challenge, or let it consume me. As I stood there, looking at the two of them, I realized that my life was no longer simple, no longer safe. I was stepping into unknown territory, a place where love and loyalty were tested, and where I would have to confront parts of myself I'd long buried. It was terrifying, but somewhere, deep down, I felt a flicker of strength. This was my life, my marriage, my story. And I wasn't about to let it slip through my fingers without a fight. The following days passed in a blur of tension and careful avoidance. The house, once a place of warmth and comfort, had transformed into a delicate battlefield. Every movement felt scrutinized, every word weighted. Mark and I were navigating an unspoken, fragile truce, but there was no denying the palpable strain. Emma's presence had shifted the axis of our lives, and we were struggling to find a balance in this strange, new reality. Establishing boundaries wasn't easy, but it was necessary. If Emma was going to stay, we needed rules, boundaries to protect what was left of my marriage, my peace of mind. After a sleepless night, I drafted a list. It wasn't long or detailed, but it outlined what I needed to feel remotely in control. That morning, I found Mark in the kitchen, making coffee. He looked up, offering a hesitant smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I held up the piece of paper with a mix of resolve and anxiety. I've been thinking about some boundaries, I said, keeping my tone calm but firm. If Emma is going to stay here, then these need to be clear. He took the paper, his expression unreadable as he read over my list. I watched him carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. The list was simple. Emma would stay in the guest room for no more than 2 weeks. Mark and I would continue to prioritize our time together, especially in the evenings, without interruptions. Discussions about the future and the baby would happen openly, without secrets or hidden conversations. Emma would respect our privacy and avoid stepping into areas of our life that were exclusively ours. Mark's gaze softened as he looked back up at me. "This is fair," he said, nodding. "I want you to know, whatever happens, you're my priority. I don't want this to come between us." Hearing his reassurance brought a slight sense of relief, but the hurt lingered. I wanted to believe him, I wanted to feel secure in his words. But the situation was so complicated, and my trust felt fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. "Thank you," I said quietly. I need these things to feel like we can handle this." He reached out, taking my hand in his. His touch was warm, familiar, but it also felt different now, as if there was an invisible barrier between us. "I understand," he said softly. "We'll get through this. Together." I nodded, clinging to that promise. Just then, Emma entered the kitchen, her face slightly flushed as if she had overheard. She paused at the doorway, glancing between Mark and me, as if unsure whether she was welcome in this moment. Her presence felt like an intrusion, a reminder of everything that had been disrupted. But I swallowed my resentment, reminding myself of the boundaries I'd just set. This was part of the deal. "Good morning," she said quietly, her eyes darting between us. She looked uneasy, like someone who'd walked into a room mid-conversation, uninvited. "Good morning," I replied, forcing a polite smile. I didn't want to make her feel unwelcome, but I also wasn't going to pretend that things were normal. This was as far from normal as it got. Emma poured herself a cup of coffee, moving around the kitchen with a sort of practiced quietness, as if trying to avoid disturbing us. I noticed the way her hand rested instinctively on her belly, a soft, unconscious gesture that twisted something inside me. This wasn't just about Mark and me anymore. A child was in the mix, an innocent life that had no part in this painful situation, but would inevitably shape the future we were trying to navigate. "Emma," I said, breaking the silence. She looked up, surprised, and I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "Mark and I have talked about this arrangement. And we think it's best if you stay here for a short while, just until you can get back on your feet." She nodded, looking relieved. "Thank you. I really appreciate it. I know this is hard for you both, and I'm sorry for the trouble." Her sincerity caught me off guard, and for a brief moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman Mark had once loved. Vulnerable, but strong in her own way. I felt a small pang of sympathy, but I quickly pushed it aside. I couldn't afford to be too compassionate right now, I had to protect myself, protect my marriage. "We just need some clear boundaries," I continued, trying to maintain a tone that was both firm and fair. "I hope you understand. This is difficult for me too." She looked down, nodding. "Of course. I'll do my best to respect your space." I exhaled, feeling a slight sense of relief. At least there was an understanding now, a framework to help us navigate this chaotic situation. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start. As the days passed, the boundaries seemed to help. There were awkward encounters and tense silences, but Emma respected our space, staying mostly in the guest room or the living room, avoiding the private areas of the house that were Mark's and mine. But even with her efforts, I couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in our routines. Meals felt quieter, strained, and the easy conversations Mark and I used to share seemed to be replaced by stilted exchanges. One evening, as I washed dishes in the kitchen, I heard quiet laughter coming from the living room. Mark and Emma were talking, their voices low but warm. My heart twisted at the sound. There was an ease between them, a familiarity that felt both natural and foreign to me. I hadn't heard Mark laugh like that in a long time, and a wave of jealousy washed over me, fierce and unexpected. "This is temporary," I reminded myself, gripping the edge of the sink. "This is just for a while." But the thoughts kept churning, my mind replaying every moment I'd seen them together, every shared glance, every quiet conversation. I knew they weren't doing anything wrong, but the closeness between them was a reminder of the connection they'd once shared, and I couldn't ignore the nagging doubt that maybe, just maybe, that connection wasn't entirely gone. Later that night, as Mark and I lay in bed, I decided to voice my fears. I couldn't keep holding them inside, letting them fester and grow. I turned to him, feeling the weight of the words I was about to say. Mark, I whispered, my voice barely audible in the darkness. He turned to face me, his expression soft and open, but I could see the worry in his eyes. Yes? Do you ever think about her? I mean, the life you could have had with her? I forced the words out, hating the vulnerability they revealed. I wasn't used to feeling this uncertain, this insecure. But I needed to know. He looked at me, his gaze steady and thoughtful. I think about the past, yes. But that doesn't mean I want it back, he said quietly. What we had is different from what I have with you. My life is with you, and I don't want you to doubt that. His words brought a slight comfort, but there was still a lingering ache, a fear that no words could entirely erase. Emma's presence was a constant reminder of everything that had come before us, of the love that had once occupied his heart. It was difficult to shake the feeling that a part of him was still tethered to that past, even if he claimed it was over. I just need to know that you're with me in this, I whispered, reaching out to touch his hand. That we're going to get through this together. He took my hand, holding it tightly. I'm here, he promised. I'm with you. No matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere. His reassurance brought a fragile sense of peace, a reminder that despite everything, he was still my husband, still the man I loved. But as the days stretched on, I tried to keep my resolve steady, clinging to the boundaries Mark and I had set. But the boundaries were only as strong as I was, and I could feel my patience thinning, fraying like old fabric. There was an unease in the air, an invisible tension that seemed to follow me from room to room. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being measured and compared, even if that judgment existed only in my mind. Emma's presence was now woven into the daily rhythms of our household. She was respectful, even careful, going out of her way to keep her distance, not overstepping. But she was there, a constant, undeniable presence in my own home, a living reminder of everything I was trying to ignore. I saw her in every corner, her belongings in the guest room, the subtle shift of our routines to accommodate her needs. I couldn't escape her presence, nor the silent acknowledgement of what her situation meant for Mark and me. One morning, as I came down to the kitchen, I found her there, cooking breakfast. She moved with a quiet grace, her expression focused as she flipped a pancake with careful precision. She didn't see me at first, and I hesitated, watching her from the doorway. There was something intimate about watching her cook, as if I had stumbled upon a private moment, a window into the life she might have had with Mark if things had gone differently. I felt a pang in my chest, a strange mix of envy and guilt. When she noticed me, she offered a small smile, her cheeks flushed. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft. "Morning," I replied, forcing myself to sound polite. I moved to the counter, opening the fridge to busy myself, trying to ignore the pang of discomfort at seeing her so at ease in my kitchen. "I made extra, if you'd like some," she offered, gesturing to the stack of pancakes on the plate. Her expression was sincere, a quiet attempt at a peace offering. "I know I've been intruding. I thought maybe this could be a small way of saying thank you." I managed a smile, taking a deep breath to steady myself. "Thank you," I said, taking a seat at the table. Despite my misgivings, the gesture felt genuine, a brief respite in the ongoing tension. "I appreciate it." We ate in silence, the only sound being the soft clinking of our forks against the plates. I found myself watching her out of the corner of my eye, noticing things I hadn't before. The way her hands rested protectively on her belly, the gentle, absent-minded caress she gave to the growing life inside her. It was a small, tender gesture, but it spoke volumes about her commitment to her unborn child. Despite everything, she was doing her best, navigating this impossible situation with a kind of quiet strength. I felt a reluctant sense of empathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by a flare of jealousy. This child, this connection she had with Mark, whether or not it was what they'd intended, it was real, and it was powerful. It was something I could never fully be a part of, no matter how hard I tried. I was an outsider in this bond they shared, a reminder that I was powerless to change the past that had brought us here. Later that day, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I wandered through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, the brisk autumn air filling my lungs, grounding me in the present moment. As I walked, I replayed the events of the past few weeks in my mind, searching for clarity, for answers. I wanted to understand, to find a way to reconcile the conflicting emotions that were tearing me apart. I found myself at the park near our house, a quiet, secluded spot that Mark and I used to visit often when we first moved here. It was a place of memories, a sanctuary where we had shared laughter, dreams, and promises for the future. But standing there now, I felt like a stranger to those memories, as if they belonged to someone else. As I sat on the bench, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark. "I'm thinking of you. Hope you're okay. Let's talk tonight." The words were simple, but they brought a lump to my throat. I wanted to believe in his promises, in his reassurances. I wanted to believe that we could weather this storm, that our love was strong enough to withstand the challenges we faced. But the doubts lingered, gnawing at the edges of my heart, casting a shadow over every moment. The walk back home felt long, heavy. When I finally entered the house, I found Emma sitting on the couch, a blanket draped over her lap, her face pale. She looked up as I entered, a flicker of vulnerability in her gaze. "Are you all right?" I asked, surprised by the concern in my own voice. She nodded, though her expression was tense. "Just feeling a little lightheaded." "It's nothing serious," she replied, offering a weak smile. I hesitated, caught between compassion and my own resentment. But in that moment, I couldn't ignore the reality of her situation. She was carrying a child, vulnerable in ways that went beyond our complicated emotions. "Do you need anything?" I asked, my voice softer than I'd intended. "Water, or maybe you should lie down for a while?" She nodded, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." I helped her up, guiding her to the guest room where she lay down, her hand resting on her belly. For a moment, I lingered in the doorway, watching her. The sight stirred something in me, a mixture of pity and, strangely, protectiveness. Despite everything, she was still a woman trying to do her best, facing an uncertain future with courage. As I left the room, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This situation was far from ideal, but I couldn't let it consume me. I had to find a way to balance my own needs, to protect my marriage without letting resentment corrode my heart. Emma was here, and she wasn't going anywhere, at least not for now. But that didn't mean I had to lose myself in the process. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Mark and I finally sat down to talk. The house was quiet, and the tension between us felt thick, like a tangible presence in the room. "I know this isn't easy," he began, his voice gentle, his eyes full of concern. "I know I've put you in an impossible situation, and I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I know, Mark. But it's a lot to handle. I'm trying to be understanding, but it's hard. I feel like everything we've built is slipping away." He reached for my hand, holding it tightly. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice raw. "I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. But I need you to tell me what you need, to be honest with me about how you're feeling." I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "I need to know that I still matter," I said, my voice trembling. "That we still matter. I can't stand the thought of being sidelined in my own life, of feeling like an afterthought while you're caught up in this past with her." He nodded, his expression somber. "You're my wife, and you're the most important person in my life. Nothing changes that. I just need you to trust me, to believe that we can get through this." I wanted to believe him, to feel the strength of his words settle into my heart. But as we sat there in the quiet, holding each other's hands. It was a gray afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds, mirroring the tension that had settled over the house. The air felt thick, charged, as if something was waiting to break. I spent most of the day in our room, pretending to organize my closet, but really, I just needed space. I needed a moment away from Emma, from Mark, from the storm of emotions that seemed to shadow me wherever I went. Late in the afternoon, as I sat on the bed, I heard a soft knock at the door. I expected Mark, but when I opened it, Emma stood there, looking uncharacteristically pale, a hand resting on her belly. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and I noticed a faint tremor in her hands. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost pleading. I hesitated, but something in her eyes softened my resolve. "Of course. Is everything all right?" She shook her head, taking a shaky breath. "I don't know. I've been feeling strange. Dizzy and I don't know, just off." She paused, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "I'm a little worried. I know it might be nothing, but..." Her voice trailed off, and for the first time, I saw her as something more than Mark's past. She was a mother-to-be, nervous and scared, grappling with the unknown. Despite my own complicated feelings, I couldn't ignore the hint of fear in her eyes. My resentment faded, replaced by a protective instinct I hadn't expected. "Let's go to the hospital," I said, reaching for my purse. "Just to be safe." Emma looked relieved, nodding gratefully. "Thank you. I didn't want to worry Mark, but I'd rather be safe than sorry." I sent Mark a quick text, telling him we were going to the hospital as a precaution, and not to worry. He called immediately, his voice laced with concern, but I reassured him, promising to keep him updated. He agreed to meet us there as soon as he could wrap up his work. It felt strange, like some twisted version of family support, but for once, my concerns felt secondary. Right now, Emma's and the baby's health were all that mattered. The drive to the hospital was quiet, the silence filled with unspoken anxieties. Emma sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed out the window. Her face was tense, her usual calm replaced by a vulnerability that made her seem almost childlike. I wanted to say something comforting, but words felt insufficient, awkward. When we arrived, I helped her inside, guiding her to the maternity ward, where she was quickly taken in for an examination. I paced the waiting room, the minutes ticking by slowly. The sterile smell of antiseptics filled the air, and I found myself glancing at the clock, my anxiety growing with each passing second. After what felt like an eternity, a nurse emerged, gesturing for me to follow her. She led me to a small room where Emma was lying on a hospital bed, her face pale but relieved. The doctor was explaining something to her, his voice calm and reassuring. "Everything seems to be okay," he said as I entered, offering me a polite nod. It was likely a combination of stress and mild dehydration. "We'll keep her here for observation, just to be safe, but I don't see anything to be overly concerned about." Emma exhaled, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, the tension in my shoulders loosening slightly. The doctor left, and for a moment, it was just Emma and me in the room, the hum of the machines filling the silence. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there. It means a lot." I managed a small smile, taking a seat beside her bed. "I'm just glad you're all right. And the baby too." She nodded, her gaze softening as she looked down at her belly. "I didn't expect this, you know. Any of it. Being here, needing help. I feel like such a burden. I never wanted to cause you trouble." Her words caught me off guard, and I could feel the sincerity in her voice. For a moment, I saw her as she truly was, vulnerable, uncertain, trying her best to navigate a difficult situation. My heart ached with a mix of compassion and confusion. This was the woman Mark had once loved, a woman who was now carrying his child. And yet, here we were, two women bound by an impossible situation, both searching for answers in a storm of emotions. "You're not a burden," I said, surprising even myself. "This isn't easy for any of us, but we're doing what we can. All of us." Emma looked at me, a glimmer of gratitude in her eyes. "I don't know if I could be as strong as you," she murmured, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "To let me stay, to support Mark through this. I don't know if I could do it." Her words struck a chord, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. She saw my strength, but she didn't see the cracks, the places where I was barely holding myself together. I wasn't as strong as she thought. I was just doing my best to survive, to protect the love I had built with Mark. But in that moment, I didn't feel like correcting her. Sometimes we don't know how strong we are until we don't have a choice, I said quietly. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. We sat in silence, a tentative peace settling between us. It was fragile, but it was real, a brief moment of understanding in the midst of the storm. Mark arrived later, his face flushed with worry as he entered the room. He went straight to Emma's side, taking her hand and asking if she was all right. I watched them from the doorway, feeling like an outsider once again. I wanted to leave, to give them privacy, but something kept me rooted to the spot. When Emma assured him she was fine, he turned to me, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you for being here with her. I don't know what we would have done without you. I shrugged, trying to play it off as no big deal. But inside, his words twisted something within me. I wanted to be strong, to be the supportive partner who could handle anything. But there was a part of me that resented the situation, that hated the way I was being pulled into this complicated dynamic, forced to share my husband with a past that I had never asked to be a part of. The nurse returned, telling us that Emma would be discharged later that evening. I let out a quiet sigh of relief, ready to go home and put this day behind me. But as we made our way back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get more complicated. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, I sat with Mark in the living room, a heavy silence hanging between us. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle, hesitant. I know this is hard, he said softly. I know I've put you in an impossible position, and I hate that you're the one who has to deal with this. But I need you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done. You're stronger than I ever realized. His words touched me, but they also stirred something painful. I didn't want to be seen as a symbol of strength, as someone who could bear any burden. I wanted to be his partner, his wife, the woman he could rely on without question. But right now, I felt like I was barely holding myself together. I'm trying, Mark, I said, my voice trembling. But this is hard. Harder than I thought it would be. And I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that I'm okay with all of this. He looked at me, his expression filled with regret. I don't expect you to be okay with it. I want you to know that I'm here, that I'm with you, even if it doesn't always seem that way. Days turned into weeks, and the new rhythm of our lives began to settle, though not comfortably. I tried my best to accept that Emma would be here for the foreseeable future, a presence I couldn't avoid no matter how hard I tried. She was respectful, and I couldn't fault her for anything beyond simply existing in my space. Still, her presence was a constant reminder of the fracture in my life, the unwanted shift in my marriage with Mark. Mark was attentive, more so than he had been in months, perhaps sensing the strain between us. He was constantly checking in, asking how I felt, offering help with little things around the house. His gestures were sweet, and I appreciated them, but they felt like patches on a ship that was already sinking. He was trying to fix something too far gone with gestures that were too small to hold back the tide of tension between us. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Mark and I sat together on the couch. The house was silent, Emma had already gone to bed, her energy drained after a long day. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Are you okay? He asked, his hand reaching for mine. I looked at him, studying his face, searching for something familiar in his expression. He looked so sincere, his eyes filled with concern, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was distant, caught somewhere between me and the life he was now building with Emma's child. I don't know, Mark, I said honestly, my voice barely above a whisper. Some days I think I can handle this, that I'm strong enough to get through it. And then there are other days when I feel like I'm losing myself. He tightened his grip on my hand, his thumb brushing softly over my knuckles. I don't want you to feel that way, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I want you to know how much you mean to me. How much I love you. I managed a small, sad smile. But love doesn't fix this, does it? It doesn't change the fact that things are different now. That there's another person, another connection, in our lives. A connection I can't ignore, no matter how much I might want to. Mark looked down, his jaw tense. I know it's not fair to you. And I wish I could change things, that I could make this easier somehow. But I need you to trust me. I need you to believe that we can make it through this. Trust. The word echoed in my mind, settling heavily in my chest. Trust was something I had always given Mark freely, without question. But now, it felt fragile, something I had to hold tightly to keep it from slipping away. I wanted to trust him, to believe in his promises, but I also knew that trust alone wouldn't be enough to make me feel secure in our relationship. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I'm trying, Mark. I really am. But this situation, it's testing every boundary I thought I had. He nodded, looking at me with a sadness I hadn't seen before. I know. And I don't take that for granted. I don't want to lose you. His words were sincere, but they felt like they were falling into a void, unable to bridge the growing distance between us. I wanted to believe him, to let his words settle into my heart, but I couldn't ignore the doubts that lingered in the back of my mind. The next day, I decided to take some time for myself. I needed space to clear my head, to breathe without the constant reminder of everything I was trying to hold together. I packed a small bag, told Mark I was going out for the day, and drove to a nearby nature reserve. The trees were thick with autumn leaves, the vibrant reds and oranges contrasting sharply with the gray sky. As I walked along the trail, I found myself reflecting on the woman I used to be, the version of myself that had existed before Emma entered our lives. I remembered the carefree moments, the certainty I'd felt in my marriage, the trust I'd had in Mark. That woman felt like a stranger now, a distant memory that I could barely recognize. A couple passed by, holding hands and laughing softly. I watched them, feeling a pang of longing for that kind of simplicity, the kind of love that wasn't weighed down by complications. I wondered if Mark and I would ever find our way back to that place, or if this was our new reality, a constant balancing act, with no room for the carefree love we once shared. Later that evening, when I returned home, I found Emma in the kitchen, cooking dinner. She looked up as I entered, offering a tentative smile. I hesitated in the doorway, watching her move with a calm efficiency, her expression serene. "Do you want some help?" I offered, surprising even myself with the question. She looked at me, her eyes widening slightly before she nodded. "Sure, if you don't mind." I was just about to start on the salad. I moved to the counter, reaching for a cutting board. We worked in silence, the only sounds coming from the chopping of vegetables and the soft clinking of utensils. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be standing here with her, working together in my own kitchen. But there was something oddly comforting about the moment, a brief respite from the tension that usually hung between us. As I sliced the tomatoes, I felt Emma's gaze on me, a question hovering on her lips. After a moment, she spoke, her voice soft. "I want you to know. I don't take any of this for granted," she said. "Your kindness, your willingness to let me stay here. I know it's not easy for you." I looked at her, surprised by her sincerity. "Thank you," I replied, my voice equally soft. "I appreciate that. And I'm trying. I'm trying to make sense of all of this, to find a way to coexist. But it's hard." She nodded, her expression understanding. "I can imagine. I wish things were different, that none of this had to be this way. But I'm grateful for your support, even if I don't say it often." Her words stirred something within me, a flicker of empathy that I hadn't expected. She was just as much a victim of circumstance as I was, trying to navigate an impossible situation with as much grace as she could manage. For a brief moment, I saw her not as the woman who had come between me and Mark, but as a woman who was simply trying to do her best. That night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The day had been filled with unexpected moments of connection, brief glimpses of understanding in the midst of the chaos. I wasn't sure what it meant, or if it would change anything, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Mark shifted beside me, his arm draping over me as he pulled me closer. His touch was warm, comforting, and I found myself leaning into him, letting the familiar feel of his embrace soothe the ache in my heart. "I love you," he whispered, his voice soft, filled with a tenderness that made my chest tighten. "No matter what, I love you." I closed my eyes, allowing his words to wash over me. In that moment, I chose to believe him, to trust that his love was real, even if it couldn't fix everything. I didn't know what the future held, or if our marriage would ever be the same, but for now, I was willing to hold on, to fight for the love we had built. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet assurance that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this storm together. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be days when the weight of it all felt too much to bear. But for now, I was willing to try, to let the ties that bound us hold us together, even if they were fragile. The days began to blur together, each one melding into the next. I found myself moving through routines, going through the motions, but the spark that once made me feel alive felt dim. Mark was often at work, and when he was home, he was attentive but preoccupied, balancing his concern for me with his growing commitment to Emma and the baby. The tension was like an invisible thread, pulling taut whenever we were in the same room, a constant reminder of the fracture in our lives. One evening, after another quiet dinner, I went to bed early, leaving Mark in the living room, buried in paperwork. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind swirling with thoughts that I couldn't seem to escape. The weight of everything pressed down on me, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel the full depth of my sadness, my resentment, and my longing for a simpler time. After what felt like hours, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. I tensed, expecting Mark, but to my surprise, it was Emma. She hovered at the doorway, her face half hidden in the dim light. "Hey," she whispered, her voice tentative. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, but then nodded, gesturing for her to sit at the edge of the bed. She moved quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze downcast. "I know it's late," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I wanted to talk to you. I feel like I owe you that." I shifted slightly, turning to face her. I didn't know what to expect, but her sincerity caught me off guard. She looked different tonight, her usual calm replaced by a quiet vulnerability that mirrored my own. "What do you want to talk about?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She took a deep breath, as if gathering her thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot, about everything, about this whole situation. And I need you to know that I never wanted to be in this position. I never wanted to come between you and Mark." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I felt a strange sense of understanding. It was as if, for a brief moment, I could see things from her perspective, see the pain and uncertainty that she must be feeling as well. She was caught in an impossible situation, just like I was, and as much as I wanted to resent her, I couldn't ignore the truth in her eyes. "I believe you," I said quietly. "I know this isn't easy for you either. And I don't think any of us could have predicted this." She nodded, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. "I guess that's life, isn't it? Sometimes it throws things at us that we're not ready for." I looked down, my fingers tracing patterns on the blanket. "Yeah, it's just hard. I thought I knew where my life was going. I thought I knew what my marriage was, and now I don't know anymore." Her eyes softened, a flicker of empathy crossing her face. "I can't imagine how hard this is for you. You have every right to be angry, to feel everything you're feeling." I swallowed, surprised by the lump that had formed in my throat. "It's not just anger. It's fear. I'm afraid of losing him. I'm afraid that there's no place for me in this new version of his life." Emma reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing a gentle hand on mine. Her touch was warm, surprisingly comforting. "You're not going to lose him. He loves you. I see it in the way he talks about you, the way he looks at you. That's why this is so hard for him. He's trying to do right by everyone, even if it means putting himself through hell." Her words surprised me, and I felt a pang of guilt for the resentment I had been harboring. I hadn't stopped to consider how difficult this must be for Mark, how much he must be struggling to balance his love for me with his responsibility to Emma and the baby. For a moment, I felt the walls around my heart begin to soften, my anger replaced by a quiet sadness. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I thought I could handle it, but every day feels harder than the last." Emma's gaze was gentle, understanding. You're stronger than you think. You've already done more than most people would. You opened your home to me, gave me a place to feel safe. That takes a kind of strength that most people don't have. Her words touched me, and for the first time, I felt a sense of solidarity with her, a shared understanding that went beyond our complicated circumstances. She wasn't my enemy, she was just another woman trying to navigate a difficult situation, trying to do what was best for her unborn child. I just want to feel secure, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I want to feel like I still have a place in his heart, in his life. Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. I think that's something only he can give you. But I know that he loves you, that he's doing everything he can to make this work. And I'm not here to take him from you. I'm here because I need help, because I want my child to have a chance at a stable life. Her words brought a strange sense of clarity, and I realized that we were both seeking the same thing, a sense of belonging, a place to feel safe and loved. It was an odd, bittersweet comfort, knowing that we were bound by this unspoken bond, a shared understanding that transcended our differences. As we sat there in silence, I felt a small weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't a solution, and it didn't erase the pain or the doubts that lingered in my heart. But it was a start, a fragile beginning to a new kind of relationship, one that was built on mutual respect and understanding. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The conversation with Emma had given me a new perspective, a glimpse into the complexities of her own emotions. I hadn't expected to feel empathy for her, to see her as more than just a reminder of my pain. But now, I saw her as a woman trying to navigate her own struggles, just as I was. When Mark came to bed, he wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close. I could feel the warmth of his embrace, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could find a way through this, together. Maybe there was room for healing, for rebuilding the love that had once felt so certain. I love you, he whispered, his voice soft and full of sincerity. I held on to his words, letting them sink into my heart. I love you too. The words felt real, solid, like an anchor in the storm. And as I drifted off to sleep, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to hold on to each other, even as our lives shifted in ways we could never have imagined. The next morning, as I sat in the kitchen with my coffee, I saw Emma preparing breakfast, her movements calm, steady. She glanced at me, offering a small smile, and I felt a warmth that I hadn't felt in a long time, a warmth that came from acceptance, from understanding. We might never be friends, but in that moment, we were allies, two women bound by an unspoken bond, each trying to navigate the path ahead with as much grace as we could manage. And in that shared understanding, I found a sliver of peace. Life settled into a quiet routine, each day bringing small moments of stability, though the tension never fully disappeared. I found myself drawn to these rare pockets of calm, savoring them like precious stones, each one a glimmer of peace in an otherwise turbulent sea. Mark seemed relieved by the change in our dynamic, and he often expressed his gratitude for my patience, my strength. I appreciated his words, though I felt that he was still balancing on a tightrope, careful not to disrupt the delicate balance we had created. His attention was divided, but his affection was genuine, and I tried to hold on to that, to let his love be an anchor as we navigated this strange, shared life. Emma and I continued to build on the tentative connection we had established. We weren't friends, not quite, but there was a new sense of understanding between us, an unspoken acknowledgement of the complexity of our situation. She had become part of my daily life in a way I hadn't anticipated, and while I still struggled with her presence, I no longer felt the same sharp resentment that had once consumed me. There was a part of me that even respected her resilience, her quiet strength in the face of her own challenges. One afternoon, as I stood in the kitchen making tea, Emma entered, her steps light as she moved toward the fridge. She glanced at me, offering a small, tentative smile. "How are you feeling?" I asked, surprised by my own question. It felt natural, easy, and I realized that I genuinely wanted to know. She smiled, a soft warmth in her eyes. "I'm good, actually. Better than I have in a while." She placed a hand on her belly, her expression tender. "I think the baby is, too." I couldn't help but smile, a strange mixture of emotions swirling within me. I wasn't sure what to make of the maternal warmth that filled her gaze, but it softened something inside me. The baby was a part of Mark, a part of the life he and I had once envisioned together. But it was also a part of Emma, a life that was growing inside her, a new beginning that I couldn't resent forever. That's good to hear, I replied, my voice gentle. I'm glad you're feeling better. She looked at me, her gaze thoughtful, as if she was trying to find the right words. You've been really kind, given everything. I don't think I could have been this strong if the roles were reversed. Her words touched something deep within me, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I didn't feel strong most days, in fact, I often felt like I was barely holding on. But hearing her acknowledgement, her recognition of the effort I was making, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't expected. It hasn't been easy, I admitted, my voice soft. But I'm trying to make peace with it, with everything. She nodded, her gaze filled with understanding. I know. And I want you to know that I don't take any of this for granted. I appreciate everything you've done, everything you're doing. There was a sincerity in her voice that felt like a balm to my heart, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace in her presence. She wasn't here to replace me, and in that moment, I felt the final pieces of my resentment begin to dissolve. It was a fragile piece, but it was enough. As the weeks passed, Mark and I found small moments of closeness, little pockets of intimacy that reminded me of the life we had built together. We would sit together in the evenings, his hand in mine, watching a movie or talking about our day. His gaze was tender, filled with the quiet love that had once felt so certain. I could see the effort he was making, his determination to keep us connected, and I found myself clinging to these moments, letting them fill the empty spaces in my heart. One night, as we sat together on the couch, I turned to him, a question that had been lingering in my mind finally surfacing. Do you ever think about the future? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his gaze thoughtful. I do. I think about it a lot. And I know it's going to be different from what we imagined, but I still want it to be with you. His words were sincere, but I could sense the hesitation beneath them, the uncertainty that we both felt but rarely spoke of. There was no way to predict what the future would hold, no way to know if this fragile peace would last. But in that moment, I allowed myself to believe in his words, to trust in the love that had brought us together in the first place. I want that too, I said, my voice filled with quiet resolve. I want us to find a way through this, to rebuild what we had. He reached for my hand, his fingers entwining with mine, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of hope that had been absent for so long. We didn't have all the answers, and there was no guarantee that we would find them, but for now, I was willing to hold on, to trust in the love that had carried us this far. The next morning, as I walked into the kitchen, I found Emma sitting at the table, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked up as I entered, a gentle smile on her face. Good morning, she said, her voice warm. Good morning, I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. I sat down across from her, the silence between us comfortable, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. After a moment, she looked at me, her expression thoughtful. I know it's not my place, but I just wanted to say that I think you and Mark are really strong. Stronger than most people would be in this situation. I looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. Thank you. That means a lot. She nodded, her gaze filled with empathy. I know it's been hard, but I hope you know that I'm grateful for everything you've done, for the way you've treated me. I don't think I would have been able to handle it if you hadn't been so understanding. Her words brought a strange sense of comfort, a quiet validation that soothed the ache in my heart. I hadn't expected to find solace in her presence, but in that moment, I felt a bond between us that went beyond our complicated relationship with Mark. We were both trying to find our way, both seeking a sense of stability in a world that felt anything but stable. Thank you, Emma, I said, my voice filled with genuine gratitude. I don't think I would have been able to handle this without your understanding either. She smiled, a warmth in her eyes that felt almost like friendship, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace in her presence, a fragile bond that was built on mutual respect and understanding. That night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, I felt a strange sense of contentment settle over me. The future was still uncertain, and there were still days when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. But in those moments of quiet connection, with Mark, with Emma, I found a new sense of clarity, a renewed strength that filled the empty spaces within me. Mark's arm draped over me, his warmth seeping into my skin, and I closed my eyes, allowing myself to believe in the possibility of healing, of rebuilding what we had lost. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges ahead, but for now, I was willing to hold on, to let this fragile peace be enough. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a quiet assurance settle over me, a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. We were bound by an unspoken bond, a shared understanding that transcended the complications of our lives. And in that
The morning
bond,
light
I found a
streamed
sliver
through the
of hope,
kitchen window,
a promise
casting
that
a
maybe,
warm glow
just maybe,
across the
we
room.
could find a way through this together. I stood at the counter, brewing coffee, my mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The air felt electric with possibility, as if the universe was whispering that a new chapter was about to begin. I watched as Emma prepared breakfast, her movements fluid and confident, her belly round and beautiful. It struck me how much had changed in such a short time. We were both navigating a landscape of uncharted emotions, but there was an undeniable sense of growth unfolding around us. As we sat down to eat, the familiar tension that had once filled our meals with silence felt diminished. There was laughter as Emma shared a humorous story from her past, a memory that reminded us both that life was still unfolding, even amidst the chaos. I found myself laughing along, the sound of our voices mingling in the air like a gentle promise of connection. "Thank you for this," I said, gesturing to the spread of eggs and toast she had prepared. "It feels nice to have a moment of normalcy." Emma looked up, her expression warm. "Normalcy is what we need right now. It's important to carve out these little moments, especially when everything else feels so uncertain." Her words resonated deeply, reminding me that I had the power to shape my own reality, to create small pockets of joy in the midst of turmoil. I realized that embracing these moments would be crucial for both of us as we continued to navigate the complexities of our intertwined lives. Later that day, Mark came home earlier than usual, his face lighting up as he walked through the door. I felt a rush of warmth at the sight of him, my partner, my confidant, the man who had once felt so utterly mine. He pulled me into a gentle embrace, and for a moment, the weight of the world slipped away. "How was your day?" I asked, my voice light. He smiled, his eyes sparkling with a hint of mischief. "Busy, as always. But I wrapped up a project ahead of schedule, so I thought I'd treat us to a little dinner out. Just the two of us." My heart soared at the thought, a surge of excitement washing over me. "Really? That sounds wonderful." "Just us, no distractions," he assured me, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "I want to reconnect, just like we used to." His words sent a shiver of hope through me, and I felt the flicker of something bright and beautiful stirring within, a reminder of the love we shared, the dreams we had built together before everything changed. As we got ready, I felt a renewed sense of anticipation, as if we were stepping into a new beginning, a chance to rediscover each other. The restaurant was a quaint little place we had frequented early in our relationship, its warm ambience filled with soft laughter and the clinking of glasses. Sitting across from Mark, I felt a sense of familiarity wash over me, mingling with a nervous excitement. As we ordered, I couldn't help but notice the way he looked at me. There was a softness in his gaze that made my heart flutter, a reminder of the depth of our connection. As the conversation flowed, we began to explore the territory of our hearts. Mark spoke candidly about his feelings, about the burden of juggling his responsibilities to both Emma and me. "I never wanted to hurt you, you know," he said, his voice earnest. "I've been struggling to find a balance, to make sure you both feel valued." I listened, my heart swelling with a mixture of empathy and hope. "I know you didn't intend for any of this to happen. I can see how hard you're trying to make it work." Mark reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, a grounding presence amidst the chaos. "I don't want to lose you. I still see a future with you, but I need to know that you're on board with this, whatever this is." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle into my heart. I had been navigating my own emotions, grappling with the uncertainty of our lives, but I knew that the time had come for me to speak my truth. "Mark," I began, my voice steady but filled with vulnerability. "I want to be part of that future. I love you, and I want us to find a way through this together. But I also need to set some boundaries for myself. I can't be lost in the shadows of your other responsibilities." He nodded, understanding shining in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I think we need to communicate more openly about our feelings, about what we want. I don't want to feel like I'm competing for your love or your attention. I need to know that I matter, that our relationship matters." Mark's expression shifted, a look of determination washing over his face. "You matter, you always have. I want to prioritize you, to make sure you feel secure. I'm just afraid of hurting anyone." His honesty resonated deeply, and I felt a rush of gratitude for the vulnerability he was showing. I understand that fear, and I'm not trying to place blame. I just want to create a safe space for us to navigate these changes together. The conversation flowed seamlessly, an ebb and flow of emotions that felt both exhilarating and liberating. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of clarity emerging from the fog of uncertainty that had clouded our lives. The discussion was difficult, but it felt necessary, a step toward the future we both desired. After dinner, we took a leisurely stroll through the nearby park, the night air cool against my skin. As we walked, I found myself lost in thought, reflecting on the journey we had taken to arrive at this moment. Every step felt like a reclamation of my power, a declaration that I was ready to embrace the unknown. "Do you think we can truly find a way through this?" I asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Mark paused, turning to face me. "I believe we can. It won't be easy, and there will be days when it feels overwhelming. But I want to try, for us and for our future." His words filled me with a sense of hope, and I felt a small smile tug at my lips. "Then let's take it one day at a time. We can't predict what's ahead, but we can commit to being honest with each other." "Agreed," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Let's make this work, whatever it takes." As the weeks turned into months, our lives began to shift, slowly finding a new rhythm amidst the chaos. Mark continued to balance his time between Emma and me, but there was a newfound openness in our communication that made the difficult moments feel more manageable. We set aside regular time for just the two of us, whether it was a quiet dinner, a long walk, or simply curling up on the couch with a movie. Each moment was a testament to our commitment, a reminder that we were still building a life together. Emma and I also grew closer, forming an unexpected bond as we navigated this new reality together. There were still awkward moments, but our shared understanding allowed us to communicate more openly, to lean on one another when the weight of our circumstances felt heavy. We began to share our hopes and fears, our dreams for the future, and I found myself growing fond of her resilience, her ability to adapt in the face of uncertainty. One evening, as we sat together, she shared her vision for her child's future. "I want to give my baby the best possible life," she said, her hands resting on her belly. "I want them to feel loved and supported, no matter what." Her sincerity touched me, and I felt a sense of connection that transcended our complicated relationship. "I want that too," I said softly. "For all of us." As spring turned into summer, I began to embrace the changes in my life with renewed enthusiasm. I started a small garden in the backyard, planting flowers and vegetables that would bloom and thrive with the changing seasons. It felt like a metaphor for my own growth, a tangible representation of the hope I was cultivating within myself. One sunny afternoon, as I knelt in the dirt, my hands buried in the soil, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The simple act of nurturing life felt empowering, a reminder that I had the ability to shape my own destiny. I was no longer just a bystander in my own life, I was an active participant, ready to embrace the unknown with open arms. The journey was far from over, and there would be challenges ahead. But I had learned to trust in my strength, to believe in the love that still bound us together. As I planted each seed, I whispered my hopes into the earth, letting them take root alongside the flowers. In that moment, I understood that new beginnings were not without their trials, but they also held the promise of growth, of transformation. And as I looked up at the clear blue sky, I felt a flicker of excitement for the future, a future that, while uncertain, was filled with endless possibilities.